Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Ahlulbayt live on Ahlulbayt TV during the week of remembering the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny's birth, and of course also the birth of Imam al-Sadiq alayhim salam. And tonight we're going to be continuing to look at the theme of Akhlaq of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. My guest tonight is Brother Ghulam Abbas Laka, and he is doing some research into the spiritual practices of Islam, but from a neurological, neuroscientific perspective. So we're going to be looking at akhlaq from a more scientific perspective and a more practical perspective in a way that we can implement it in our lives as well. Do feel free to call in with any questions and comments. Assalamu alaikum. So thank you for giving us your time for this very interesting angle on our daily practices in this deen, the du'as, recitation of Quran, our attempt to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we're going to be looking at the idea of service and gratitude. From this perspective, I think it's very interesting for everybody, inshallah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. All praises to Allah, the Creator of the universe and its Sustainer, the Provider of believers and non-believers. And may His choicest blessings be on the seal of His prophets, the last of His messengers and His holy progeny. And in particular, on this evening, may we have the blessings of being able to reflect upon what this Rahmatun lil Alameen, what this blessing for all the worlds, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, means for us today in the 21st century context. Yeah. And part of that current context is the plague of mental health problems that we face, in particular depression, but also anxiety. So the question that arises is, how can we harness the teachings of the Holy Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny for helping us with these challenges that we currently face? And in that regard, I think akhlaq is a natural place to begin, for it is accepted by Muslims of all the major schools that he has said that the primary purpose of his mission, the primary purpose of Islam, no less, is the perfection of human character, of what we call akhlaq. His words being, "Innama bu'ithtu," surely I've been sent, li'utammima, for the purpose of developing makarim al-akhlaq, the perfection of human character, or we could translate that as ethics. Regardless of which of the many words we use to translate the word akhlaq, from a practical point of view, it's about psychology. It's about how we are with ourselves, with the world around us, and ultimately with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in that regard, there are at least half a dozen practical aspects of the akhlaq teachings and the spiritual practices related to that I believe can help us with our mental health and our well-being more broadly, inshallah.
It's very important as well because, as you say, the rates of depression are rising, and they're saying especially among young people now. It's very common for teenagers to be on antidepressants these days. And some people might not know how to utilize these teachings. They may say, well, I'm already doing my salah, or I'm already, doing the necessary practices, but I just can't seem to find the key to, getting rid of my depression or my, whatever other, condition, that person might have. So it's good to have this kind of practical, psychological look at it, I think.
I think, I entirely agree with what you're saying, but in terms of perspective, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this is about a partnership between psychological therapy from a healthcare point of view and spiritual practice working together in tandem. This is not about substituting away the medical interventions that we get from psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. This is about seeing what are we already doing in our spiritual practice that can help us, that can be like a scaffold, a framework to perhaps give us greater benefit. Or personalized mental health is a big theme at the moment. And perhaps we may be able to, with working with our medical friends, customize therapies for Muslims in a way that helps us get the best of both worlds, so that we can actively work towards the prayer of Rabbana atina, Allah give us fi dunya hasana, good in this world, wa fil akhirati hasana, and benefit in the hereafter. And I think it's really important that that prayer has been structured in that order, such that perhaps in order to get benefit in the hereafter, we need to start experiencing it now, because perhaps that changes who we are being as human beings. And perhaps it changes what it means to be a Muslim. And from that realization, then achieve the spiritual salvation. Regarding a really important point you made about depression and various other issues in the mental health space, I mean, the Quran is pretty emphatic about it in many verses. Surah Ra'd, for instance, Surah 13, verse 28, which is the well-known teaching, Allah bi dhikrillah, surely by the remembrance of Allah, tatma'innul qulub, the hearts attain tranquility. But it raises so many questions. So what does dhikr actually mean?
Yeah.
What are the different forms of dhikr? And what are the most appropriate applications of dhikr, the forms of dhikr, for me now in my current context? I think that requires considerably more self-reflection, self-analysis, which is core to therapies like cognitive behavior therapy. Any kind of cognitive therapy is really about thinking about thinking. Thinking about how we think, thinking about what we think about, also thinking about what we don't think about, like the good things, and how we're sometimes locked in thinking patterns about bad things, negative things, self-defeating things, ruminating upon that. So whilst the Quran offers a way out, it is upon the individual to walk that path out. And the Quran is also clear about that. To pick up on a verse that we have looked at in our previous discussions together, from Surah Rum, verse 8, really clear question. أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ, do they not reflect upon themselves? Now, we looked at this verse in the context of the psychology of dua and the psychology of fasting. But when you look at it in terms of personal mental health and personalization of our treatments, then I think it changes the meaning quite considerably, because then dhikr can have a much more powerful role in all its different forms, not just on the prayer mat with powerful techniques like the tasbih bi Fatima alayhi salam. And we've tried to do research on that, and also looked at the neural correlates of what happens when we do dhikr, how the brain responds, and we're seeing some really interesting things regarding that. But in terms of what I can do at home now, there are at least 5 different things that we can explore with your permission.
Inshallah, thank you. So you were going to start with, first of all, service and altruism.
Yes, I think, inshallah, if we begin with that, it is a fitting tribute as we celebrate the birth of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and indeed of Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, who has taught us to identify and build on the science within spirituality and the spirituality within science, so that the two become two sides of the same coin, that as we deepen our understanding of one, our perception of the other increases. These distinctions that we have between science and religion are really very recent. They're only a couple of hundred years old. If we look at the history of human scholarship, previous generations have not drawn such distinctions. And whenever you draw lines on a map, you not only gain things, but you also lose things. And I think it's important that now we have a more holistic understanding of what the science of psychology and neuroscience can tell us, to make us better with our spiritual understanding, and vice versa. Because I think there's a symbiosis there that is more open in the current times because of the advent of new scientific techniques than perhaps may have been available in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of these distinctions became more pronounced. So in terms of beginning with the example of the akhlaq of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, his service, his altruism. Now, what does current research tell us about the benefits for our mental health from service? Well, for about 20 years, psychologists were looking at the benefit to people's psychological well-being when they receive help, when people are serving them. And they found very little correlation between being a recipient of someone serving you and your well-being. So when they flipped it and they started looking at the benefit to serving others, then they started getting all kinds of statistically significant results. So in '97, there was a research paper that found that actually you get improved mood quite consistently. Secondly, it can also serve as a buffer to stress. That was a more recent finding in 2000, whereby, you know, today people talk about stress being the big worry, and that, you know, you can get heart disease and all kinds of other things. But actually, if you do other things in addition to the stress-generating things, for example, service, it can serve as a buffer to that. And there was a more recent study in 2013 which found that actually, when they looked at a large number of people among the elderly, that those who had served others in the last year actually had much better outcomes in terms of their morbidity and in terms of their mental health than those who hadn't. And there's research to show that even when you look at service to a long-term partner, a husband, a wife, that service to that spouse is directly related to the well-being of the person who gives that service. It gives us a different perspective on that verse from Masterton, verse 21, that we recite at nearly every wedding, where the Quran says, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ, and He has placed between them, مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And when we translate mawadda, we often use the word love, but actually it's so much deeper than that. It's a love that is rooted in spiritual realization. And then the rahmah being the compassionate external manifestation, the mawadda being the internal, the rahmah being the external. And actually, when you have service grounded in that love, it's mutually beneficial. It's not just the husband or the wife who benefits when the person is serving, but it's actually the server, him or herself, benefiting. There is a reciprocity there. And modern psychological research is showing us that. But actually, the Akhlaq teachings have been encouraging that since the beginning of the Akhlaq traditions, with the Rahmatun lil Alameen himself, the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him.
Very interesting. So that should encourage everyone out there, all families, to serve each other and help each other, make more tea, make more coffee, make more nice dinners.
But even a smile. So we see from the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, that actually a really important part of service is smiling.
Yeah.
But that's harder than it seems. We might think, oh, it's just a smile, but actually it's not just a smile. Because you have to work really hard to put yourself in a mental state where you can smile. And that's the hard thing. Because often we are locked up in our own internal situation, which precludes that. So sometimes we need a prayer before the prayer. If we are not able to smile and offer a prayer from the heart for the person we are meeting, then perhaps we can have a prayer before that to pray that we're in a position to offer that kind of a prayer, where we may still be somewhat sullen or sulky when we meet one another, but to pray that we may be in a position to have that lightheartedness, to be able to smile, because therein lies a form of service in and of itself.
I think, you know, I've had this experience out on the streets of London where, you know, I mean, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, his holy progeny, encouraged us to spread salam among each other. And you can find that, you know, you might be on a bus or on a street or a train, and there's someone sitting near you, opposite you, looking, like I say, very sullen. And then you somehow manage to catch their eye and you smile. In fact, I think I did some experiments many years ago about, let me see, you know, if I can make this number of people smile today on the street. And you get the transformation of that person's face, you know. So if you make an effort to smile, for me, you know, it's other Muslim women, other women, you smile and you see the face light up. You see a totally other side of that person. Yes. And it also, like you say, gives you something back. It's, you know, I've made I've made them happy by smiling at them, but I've seen a really nice side to that person. It's revealed something to me that I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't given that smile as well.
And if we look at the teachings from the Holy Prophet as we celebrate his birth, we actually notice that that was a key part of the way he taught, the teaching without words, which is such a big part of akhlaq.
Yeah.
So whilst I would hesitate to smile at people on the train in case I get misunderstood, being a Muslim man in 21st century Britain has its challenges.
Yeah.
But if you're holding the door open for someone,
yeah.
you can do it with a smile. If you're letting someone go before you onto the train, you can smile at that. There are many occasions to give. And that aspect of giving, just energy and giving some sense of kindness, has a reciprocity. Some of the research on neuroscience is really quite interesting in this. So, of course, there are many ways of looking at what's happening in the brain. One of the more popular techniques now is functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, where they put people into this tube and they look at what's happening in the brain as they do different activities, different functions. And when they looked at a particular form of experiment to look at behavior relative to other people, they found that when people engage in empathetic practices in helping others, the core reward mechanisms in the brain actually light up like a Christmas tree as we meet in December. It's really quite interesting. One could, when reading the Akhlaq teachings and the Quranic teachings, you may actually notice something about fitrah, about the way we've been hardwired, that perhaps when we act in accordance with that, there are core aspects of our being that are activated. And we see that neural activation in the data. And there are a number of papers I could cite, even in the field of, for instance, neuroeconomics, where they look at how when people interact with each other on an economic basis and how the neural correlates of that behavior shape out. You can actually see reward mechanisms kicking in when you're nice to each other. In fact, it also serves as a vaccine, as an inoculation to not engaging in reciprocal behavior. So if someone does something nice to you, you're then more likely to do something nice back or to other people. So actually, you may be helping third parties by helping one person, because that energy may actually
it carries on. Has a continual effect. Yes,
has a leveraged impact.
Yeah,
beyond what you may have done as an individual. So I think service is grossly underrated in its mental health benefits for the person serving.
Yeah. I think also, I mean, we have a lot of, I suppose, charitable activity among Muslims and other religious groups as well, but statistics said that Muslims give more to charity than other religious groups, or some, research said that. And in a way, it can become, it's kind of like a way of life that we could even start to take for granted, because I've spoken also to non-Muslims who have a nice life, one or two, let's say. They have a nice life, they don't have any particular stresses, they've got everything they need materially, they're settled and so on. But they feel something is missing in their life, and they feel that they need some kind of meaning, They might have everything there comfortably, and that what they have might be what a lot of people are striving for. But they have that, but they feel that the only way they can actually feel content is by giving. And so I think that we can take this giving for granted, because for people who don't have that inculcated into their way of life, they are actually out there searching, how can I serve? Or, I wish I could go and do this, I wish I could go and do that. But they're sort of locked into this kind of...
I think it's really important to distinguish between sadaqah, giving, and giving money. Because all too often people feel, I'm in a really difficult situation, I can't give any more money. or I can only give a small amount. But that's not really the point. I think the point is the practice of giving. It's working, it's giving a workout to that muscle. And if the giving cannot be financial, it can be a smile. It doesn't need to take time.
Yeah.
I think we need to break two assumptions about giving. The literature actually is much broader about sadaqah than just money. There's time, there is kindness. So even if you don't have time, just a smile. And I think actively recognizing that I am in the process of serving is important. Not in a sort of arrogant sense of achievement sense, but in a sense of actually being in the process, so that we can also be charitable to ourselves. You notice a correlation between people who are unable to be gentle with themselves also being unable to be gentle to others.
Yeah.
So when we look at the dua tradition, which we may look at later, we have verses like "Zalamtu nafsi," that I have been a tyrant upon myself. And sometimes we are tyrannical about not having progressed in the way we want to, spiritually. And just recognizing where we are now, experiencing the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now, can liberate us from that. Often people translate the word taqwa as being piety. But really, when you go deeper into the root of the word, it's much more about mindful presence of Allah. It's really about stripping away the past and not getting drawn into the future and experiencing the present moment, submitting to the present moment as it is. It's not by coincidence that Islam is about submitting. It means submitting.
Yeah.
It's not by coincidence that the pinnacle of salah, which we can also look at, is the sujood, is the prostration. That's submitting to reality as it is. And in that moment of presence, experiencing the tawheed that Islam is based upon, the connection to Allah now, regardless of what may have happened in the past and what we hope or may be worried about in the future.
So we've just got 5 minutes till we go to break, and inshallah we will be later on in the program looking at specific practices, recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha, wudu, niyyah, sajda, inshallah. And we were going to also touch upon next the subject of gratitude, which you've touched on before. It's always good to be reminded.
Gratitude is a really interesting one because it's so simple as a practice, but it is almost beguilingly simple. This I think of as a diamond that has been given. But, as a child, I play with this and I don't know the value of it. I play with it as a marble in the sand. But really, when you look at the value of gratitude, we're taught after the required prayers, the salah, we go into sajda and you do sajda shukr. You say shukran lillah 10 times. Thank you to Allah. But actually, if you do it in a ritualistic way, or whether you do it in a mindful way, it changes your experience of it. And when we look at some of the recent research, particularly in the field of positive psychology, in relation to gratitude practices, the research has been really interesting. So, firstly, you see fewer depressive symptoms for those people who actively are grateful for what's happening in their lives, the good that's happening in their lives. And that was a paper in 2012. Earlier, it was reported that you also have less stress that's been reported at difficult times in your life, at times of transition. So when you're going through a tough time, actually being grateful for what is positive helps you. And that was a paper in 2008. Subsequent papers have also found an overall level of well-being. So actually cultivating an attitude of gratitude is helpful. And there was a study done in California recently where a professor of psychology had 2 groups of students. One group was required to identify 5 good things in their lives every Sunday evening. And another did a control condition, something separate. And they found that over time, the group that was practicing gratitude had higher self-reported measures of well-being. So it's really quite interesting how this practice of shukr, of gratitude, of identifying that which is positive, is incredibly powerful, yet so simple. By the way, it doesn't take any time either.
That's true.
You can do it as you're walking to work or whatever. Just one good thing that's happened. But when you go into sajda, rather than just saying shukran lillah 10 times, identify specific things for which we're grateful, even if it's one.
I was going to say also that sometimes you would be surprised about finding gratitude within people that in your eyes, they are very disadvantaged.
Yes.
You get stories of people who have travelled to very, poverty-stricken countries and areas where people are living in very difficult conditions. And in their mind, they're thinking, these poor people, it's terrible, and how are they surviving? And they interact with them, and the people are, would you like a cup of tea? Let us, be your hosts, and alhamdulillah, and they've got this, they're more kind of self-possessed and have a better state of well-being than the person who's kind of gone to visit them out of sympathy. But just before we continue, we're just about to go to break, and do keep watching. Inshallah, we'll be back in a few minutes. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Ahlulbayt live on Ahlulbayt TV, where we are remembering the birth of the Holy Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny, and Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam as well. And remembering them, we are looking at the subject of akhlaq. As we know, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his holy progeny said that he was sent to perfect akhlaq in humanity. And we are looking at the benefits of practicing ethical behavior for us, for ourselves, as well as for those around us also. So just before we went to break, we were looking at gratitude. And again, Brother Ghulam Abbas, you've touched on this before, but again, I think it's a very good reminder, because I think people do get into these cycles of thinking, or habitual thinking of, everything is so terrible, and, people can be habitually discontented. And I've heard that negative thinking or discontentment also has obviously an impact on those around you as well. So it can actually have perhaps a more severe impact than people realise in terms of, energetically, and how we are managing other people's well-being as well.
Yes, indeed. From a mental health point of view, you often find mental health conditions being accompanied by negative thinking. So, for instance, if you look at various forms of therapies, for instance, cognitive behavior therapy, which is widely offered on the NHS, one of the points is to be able to recognize negative automatic thoughts that we have, those NATs as they call them.
Okay.
And one of the ways of breaking that maintenance cycle that keeps all of these negative ruminations in place, one of the ways we can break that is through gratitude. That's why I think it's a really simple but powerful practice, that when you have that sajda of shukr after salah, and we do that at least 5 times a day.
Yeah.
So you've got many opportunities throughout the day to break free from the mental ruminations that may be damaging, maybe negative, and disconnect from that and reconnect with something more wholesome. And it also reminds us about the false correlation, the false relationship we may think that exists between external well-being and internal well-being. That, if someone's got everything going well for them in their lives externally, that internally they must be happy. Well, that's just not the case. We know that from our experiences. But one of the points that distinguishes is gratitude. So the extent to which one can find the positive, regardless of what other negativity may be out there. And that has a tremendous bearing on our well-being.
Yeah. And then, as we were talking about earlier on with service, that a smile to someone or doing something for someone produces a positive reaction in that person, and then that can have a knock-on effect elsewhere in their lives. So us feeling gratitude, a sense of gratitude, gladness, we could say, for what we have in our life, will likewise have a knock-on effect with those around us and so on.
But there's a big danger in this.
Right.
And the big danger is that we confuse the simple for the simplistic. So people, oh yeah, this is really simple, but it's really hard when you look at it. How many people do each of us know who really can practice gratitude? Really practice it, live it. So it may be something very simple, but actually the fact that it's simple, and we've seen it in the Akhlaq teachings, is a manifestation of the grace of the teachings, that they're simple, but they're extremely powerful, and they're not simplistic. They have quite deep profoundness, and neither are they easy. This is why the reward is so great, both in this world and the hereafter, potentially, in terms of salvation value. But in terms of benefiting now for ourselves and those around us, this is not easy. And if we recognize the challenge, we may be able to shield ourselves from the attacks of shaitan in making us think, oh, you can forget about that, that's just a simple thing. Look at something more complicated.
Right.
That's more worthy of your intellectual level. Well, actually, if we follow that wrong thought, we're throwing away a really important practical technique that's hard. And so we need to work on it like we go to the gym. So lifting a dumbbell is a very simple thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's not an easy thing to do. And you only get benefits to your muscles if you do it regularly. So that practice that we have within Salah, for instance, this simple thing of that sajda shukr, this is incredibly powerful. If it's recognized for the technique that it actually is, rather than just ritualistic tick boxing.
It reminds me actually, when I was looking a little bit into Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, some of his narrations on expressing his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on the theme of love or mahabba, you know, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just looking at his du'as, you know, the things that he says, in short, you know, he begins by saying, Alhamdulillah, you know, thanks to Allah. And you're thinking, but you went through Karbala, you went through Sham, you know, you've seen what you've seen, you've been through what you've been through, and yet you're composing, you know, all of this material, all of these words, du'as, and, you know, munajats as well, that are full of gratitude. And that makes you think, because you think to yourself, what state of mind or what internal state was did he have, was he in, to be able to express that? So he must have had a secret, we could say, that, you know, he had a state, he experienced a state, he had a perspective that meant that he was, like you say, not dependent upon the vicissitudes of what he'd been through. He wasn't dependent upon Yazid being nice to him. For him to be grateful to Allah, it's like, well, regardless of what you people do to me, regardless of the injustice that I've seen and experienced, you're not going to stop me from feeling grateful to Allah.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's really fitting that when we celebrate the birth of the Holy Prophet, we also recognize the role of female leadership in Islam from a spiritual point of view. Because when we look at his granddaughter, Zainab alayhi salam, when she was supposedly taunted by Ubaidullah in Kufa, when he taunted her about, well, look what Allah did to your family, and her response in terms of being able to separate the external from the internal realization of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace, when she said, Ma ra'aytu, I did not see anything, illa jamila, other than the grace of Allah, the beauty of Allah's grace through what was happening. Now, we may not be able to be at that level, but we can also try and see the positive in what we're experiencing, even though it may manifest as negative. And this is where I think Salah and our recitation of the Holy Quran has important value as a framework, as scaffolding around which we can build our spiritual progress and our mental well-being simultaneously.
So yes, you were going to look at Surah Al-Fatiha.
Yes, I think it's really important that we try and find greater value, particularly from a psychological point of view, from what we're already doing. People are busy, and there's a lot of stress on people already, just to make ends meet, just to keep the family together, just to keep life together without having things fall apart. often people don't have the time to do extra prayers or extra optional things. So the question that occurred for me was, what can we do to get more value from what we're already doing? And one of the obvious places to look is Salah, because it's mandatory. But one of the aspects, and whilst we have a lot of freedom in Salah, in terms of, for example, which surahs we recite, as the second surah, the first surah is required. Surah Fatiha, Surah Al-Hamd. And alhamdulillah, we see that from across the Islamic tradition. That's one aspect that unites us.
Yeah.
But it also raises the question of why? Why is it that of all the beautiful chapters of the Quran, this particular one is made mandatory, obligatory, to be recited at least 10 times a day? What is it about this chapter that allows us to do that? And requires us to do that? Because if Allah has made something obligatory within our teachings, the recognition is that it is obligatory because it is for your benefit. That's why it's been made obligatory. Yeah. God doesn't need us to do these things. We need to do these things for our own well-being. That's how we've been fashioned, created. So what are the mental health benefits of Surah Fatiha? Now, that's a question that is too broad to address in one sitting. But if we just pick one or two aspects of just two verses. So you picked on Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Now, when we look at what the mystics have said about this throughout the generations, we see so much about this. From the Shia tradition, Ayatollah Khomeini, may Allah elevate his soul, has said in his book Sirr al-Salah, The Secrets of Salah, Miraj al-Salikin, the spiritual ascension of those who worship. In that, he's devoted a whole section, a whole chapter to Surah Fatiha. And when we look at various forms of exegesis, tafsir of the Holy Quran, we see that these scholars devote an inordinate amount of space to Surah Fatiha in terms of unraveling some of the psychology we have therein. And I'd like to pick on one or two. So this idea of hamd, rendered in the definite, alhamd. And I'd like to pick on a Sunni source for this, Kushairi, who is reputed to have been a Shafi scholar, but also one of the early Sufis who tried to bring mysticism within the folds of the Sharia. And he's got various texts associated with him, for example, his famous Risala fi Tasawwuf. And one of the points that these scholars are making is that when we speak about Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, the term rendered in the definite, Alhamd, has a lot of power to it, because it means that all praise is to Allah, even words that may be discounting the presence or the grace of Allah. So even the declaration of the atheist of his or her atheism is still hamd, because of the manifestation of the grace of Allah in creating the free will of an individual to be able to think for themselves and speak for themselves, and to be able to create the beings, to be able to listen to that and form their own perceptions of that. That freedom is a manifestation of hamd. Now, from a psychological point of view, if we believe that, if we recite Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen at least 10 times a day, and if we do it with mindfulness, we may think, well, actually, what aspects of my life, even in the negative, can be hamd? So it's a direct invitation to the reciter to identify the positive.
Yeah.
If you are truly reciting it in the way it's written in the Quran, you have to recite it as the definite, grammatically. So if it's going to be in the definite, then if all manifestation and all action and all forms of energy movement is hamd, emanating from the original hamd that created, that brought forth creation, that kun, that resulted in fayakun, that be, and it was. That initial kun is a form of hamd, and therefore all other forms of creation subsequently are echoes of that original hamd.
Right.
So when we recite that Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and then we just carry on with the rest of the prayer, it raises a question. What is this hamd now? And how is it different to a few hours ago in the previous prayer I recited?
Yeah.
Because if you're doing it 10 times a day, it can't be the same. We're not the same.
Yeah.
We have just been through a few hours of experience. It may be positive, it may be negative. It may be unconscious, we may have been sleeping. But we are older. So what extra experience do we bring to the recitation of this particular hamd? And in that particularness, in that specificity, we free ourselves from the past and the future. It's about encouraging the individual to be present to the grace, to the hamd of Allah now.
Yeah.
Not as we may have thought about it in the past or hoped for it in the future, but to experience it in the present. And in the present is the only place we can experience God. Not in the past and not in the future. For when we meet Him in the future, it will be in the present of that future time. It's only in the present moment. As the mystics throughout the ages have declared, one can never experience Tawheed, that oneness of Allah.
Yeah.
And this is why I think Surah Al-Hamd is grossly underrated. We as Muslims do not do justice, and I in particular, do not do justice to this chapter. Because the power in there to break the cycles of rumination, the thought patterns of negative stories in our head, that old videotape that is now worn out, that keeps being repeated about ourselves, about others. Silencing that is really hard. But Surah Al-Hamd is a tool for that. And the second technique, and I've only looked at the first word of Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The rest of it is equally inspiring, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. This idea of Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, this is incredibly powerful. We have great scholars from the Shia tradition, Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai, for instance, may Allah elevate him. His soul may no longer be with us in this realm, but his wisdom most certainly is. And I think Al-Mizan, his powerful exegesis, is a great place to look for the psychology of Surah Al-Hamd.
Right.
And this particular verse, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, I think is really important for our relationship to ourselves. And why I say that is because if we look at the meanings of Ar-Rahman, the most beneficent, and Ar-Rahim, the most gracious, when we look at how the scholars have interpreted this, the idea of Rahman is generic. It's for all of creation. And we see the analogy of the sun, where the sun illuminates the whole landscape. But the word Rahim is about that particular ray that falls on that particular heart of that specific human being at that moment in time. And so the scholars talk about Rahman being for everyone, Rahim being for the believers.
Right.
But the believers, I would suggest, really about the believers who are cognizant in that present moment. Because it's in that moment of recognition, of awareness, of mindfulness, that you get to taste the sweetness of that Rahim. Whereas Rahman has wider metaphysical dimensions.
Right.
We've got Ibn Kathir, we've got so many people who have commented on how this aspect has profound philosophical dimensions of creation, the whole of creation as being Rahman. And Rahim really being about the invitation to recognize in that present moment. But if we go back to mental health, whether it's techniques for anxiety, whether it's techniques for depression, much of psychological interventions today, particularly the sort of talking therapies, are about recognizing what's happening now. And often people use the example of feeling the body. Mm-hmm. What is recognizing what's happening in your body right now. I don't think it's by coincidence that Salah is a physical practice. And wudu is a requirement for that before, which we can come to in a moment, in terms of grounding ourselves in the physicality that we have been created within. Not just as disembodied spirits, but actually as grounded in physicality. And that physicality is a form of grace in and of itself. But we can come to the salah aspect in a moment, but just to finish on Rahman and Rahim, if we recognize the munificence of that grace, the extent of that bounty, it raises the question that if I believe in the magnanimity, the grace, the generosity, the forgiveness of God, then how can I be aligned to that if I am withholding it from myself? That if He is sending the radiance of His light towards me, why do I block it with standing in the shadow?
Yeah.
Why do I block it by holding something against that sunlight so that I remain in darkness? And that holding up of a block against that grace is often in the form of zalamtu nafsi, of that being a tyrant to oneself. If we are unable and unwilling to forgive ourselves, then to what extent are we acknowledging the infinite generosity and grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is not about saying, oh, the bad thing I did is okay. It's not about relinquishing responsibility. Yeah. It's about tasting the beauty and the sweetness of forgiveness in the moment, of setting ourselves free from the past by stepping into the present consciously, and not just blundering from the past into the future, bypassing the present moment where all the beauty exists and where the connection exists.
I think this is something that everybody, overlooks a lot. The present moment, and very much, are concerned, like you say, with the past, what happened in the past, who did what in the past, who said what in the past. And as you say, anxieties about the future or hopes for the future. And of course, lots of du'as for the future. I mean, du'a is encouraged, but this means that people are naturally, anxiously hoping for khair, for good, to occur, sort of in the near future or in the distant future. So we are kind of very much occupied with, as you say, what has happened in the past, and sometimes, people trying to get over the past, or having been affected by the past, they're kind of stuck in this trauma of the past, and also projecting for the future. But then the question does arise, what about the present? Because
yes, indeed. And I think it is extremely foolish to believe that the things we've discussed just now are somehow simple. They're not, and they're not easy. If they had been, you would see lots of enlightened people walking along the road. The fact that spiritual masters are exalted as enlightened beings because they are rare tells us a lot about how hard it is to be in the present moment. And if we look at current research, for instance, mindfulness practice, there is a lot of literature. Just a recent survey in 2015 found that there had been over 180 scientific studies on the neuroscience of mindfulness and what happens in the brain when you practice, for example, mindfulness meditations, to experience the present moment more fully. And there's a growing body of literature showing the various benefits from a mental health point of view, and indeed also a physical health point of view, from practicing mindfulness meditations, which is really, in the Islamic tradition, dhikr practice. I think we really underrate our dhikr. For instance, that the Specail Ahlulbayt, we see that this practice of reciting 34 Allahu Akbar, 33 Alhamdulillah, 33 Subhanallah after our practices, after our prayers in particular, we see that that's done in a very ritualistic way. I just do my tasbih, get my tick and go. But Imam Baqir alayhi salam, the illustrious father of the Imam whose birth we celebrate, Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, reminds us that had there been a more precious gift that the Holy Prophet could have given to his beloved daughter Fatima alayhi salam, he would have. But this is the gift he gave us. This is the gift he gave her and through her to us. So that this gift of mindfulness practice, of tasbih, is actually something incredibly powerful that we need to treat as the most precious form of medicine. And we see in Dua Kumail, in the final flourish, we see the words from Imam Ali alayhi salam, Ya man ismuhu dawaun, or the one whose name is a medicine, is a remedy. وَذِكْرُهُ شَفَاءٌ, and whose remembrance is a form of cure, a form of salvation, a form of deliverance from what we have been experiencing before. That dhikr is incredibly powerful, and it links in with hamd, that the surah reminds us of.
Thank you. Just got, again, a couple of minutes before we go to break. I was just going to make one comment about how personally what I have found with dhikr, regular dhikr, even if it's just, say, 100 salawat, or a tasbih of just 100 or of a name of Allah, is that if it is done regularly or daily, then it's, it has, it's almost like, of course it's completely subjective, but it seems to have the effect of immediately tuning you in to something that becomes increasingly efficacious or powerful as you go along. So it doesn't have to be, again, like we've been talking about people's time limits, it doesn't have to be 1,000 of this or 2,000 of that, but just daily or regularly can still kind of tune you in to, that, I don't know what you could call it, we can say blessings, tuning you into those blessings.
Interesting how we've got 5 regular prayers through the day.
Yes.
Spread out through the day that recommend this thereafter.
Thank you very much, and we're just going to go to break again. Inshallah, we will see you again in a few minutes. Do feel free to call in with any of your thoughts. See you in a few minutes, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.